And we're live.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Sectarian Shami, and I'm one of the two moderators of this panel, together with my colleague, Adam Haniya. Our panel today, this evening, for me at least, is called Exploring the New Regional Dynamics of the Middle East. And this panel is part of the series of webinars organized by the project entitled 10 Years On. And this project is organized by, and the series of webinars is organized by the Arab Studies Institute, by the Arab Barometer Project at Princeton University, and by the Middle East and Islamic Studies program at George Mason University. I am the director of the Arab Council for the Social Sciences, and Adam Haniya is with the University of Exeter, and this panel is co-organized by our two institutions. And we have with us an amazing group of presenters and speakers who are involved in our two organizations and part of several projects that we are co-organizing on regional dynamics and new regionalisms in the Middle East, North Africa region. So I will speak a few minutes just to introduce you to the Arab Council for Social Sciences for those who are not familiar with it, and then turn it over to my colleague, Adam Haniya. So the Arab Council for Social Sciences is a regional nonprofit independent organization that's working to promote the social sciences and humanities across the Arab region. We celebrate this year our 10th anniversary. So we've been working for 10 years now from our headquarters in Beirut, Lebanon, which is where I'm joining you today. We are headquartered in Beirut, but we work across all 22 countries in the Arab region and also engage in several global collaborations. We work, the ACSS has a number of activities, and I hope you'll look up our website and look up our Facebook page. We give out a series of grants and fellowships through 7 programs. We have several working groups. We convene a conference every 2 years, a research forum every 2 years, and we're about to have our first inaugural training academy this July. We engage in publications and seminars and trainings and many other activities. This particular panel and these sets of questions that we're hoping to explore tonight emerge out of one of our working groups, which is coordinated by Adam Haniya, which is called New Regionalisms. And so I turn it over to him now to explain more about the working group and about this panel and our objectives in this webinar. So over to you, Adam.
Thank you very much, Setni. As Setni said, I'm a professor in the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at the University of Exeter. This is a part of the New Regionalisms working group at the ACSS that Setni noted. We set up this working group a couple of years ago, basically to look at the changing regional dynamics in the Middle East, trying to understand some of the cross-border flows that we see, the impact of conflict, the exploring concepts of the region, trying to challenge some of the older kind of area studies models of looking at the Middle East. Also, we were very interested in exploring the connections between the Middle East and other parts of the global system, including other core areas in the world market, as well as nearby and South-South relationships with the Middle East and elsewhere. So we've held a couple of workshops, and we're looking at developing some working papers and publications coming out of the working group. Obviously, in the last year or so, it's been a bit more difficult to organize, but in many ways, the themes of the working group have become even more pressing with the pandemic and the ongoing displacement and conflict in the region. So these are some of the themes that we hope to explore. We're happy, I think, to have with us some of the participants in the working group in a recent workshop that we held. One of the things we try to do in the working group is also be representative, moving beyond some of the kind of disciplinary boundaries and some of the ethno-nationalist conceptions of the Middle East. So we try to also look at the region inclusive of Iran and Turkey, and as I said, other connections between the region and neighbouring areas. So we hope to have quite a broad-ranging discussion. There's obviously a lot going on in the region, including the struggles in Palestine that we hope to touch on a little bit later as well. So just some of the logistics. We've got some people with us here on Zoom, as well as people watching and participating through the Facebook streams. If you would like to ask questions at any point, for those participants on Zoom, you will see a Q&A button down the bottom. You can drop a question into there, and once we've heard from our panelists, Setting and I will feed those questions to the panelists. Likewise, if you have questions on Facebook and you're watching this from Facebook, you can place your questions in Facebook, and that will also be passed on through to us. So the way we'll organize today's event is we're going to ask each of our 6 speakers to briefly reflect on some of the themes of the region and the new regional dynamics within their own interests and areas of expertise. So they will each speak for 5 or 6 minutes. Stephanie and I will then ask a couple of questions, which we'll ask again for short responses from each of the panelists, and then we'll open it up for the discussion from the audience. So again, it's a great pleasure to be here, and I thank the panelists and Stephanie and all these co-sponsors of this event tonight or today. And perhaps I'll pass it back to Stephanie now to introduce our first speaker.
Thank you, Adam. And we'll be starting with Seda. We decided to give very short introductions, so we're really not being fair. There's a lot to say about every single person who's here and who's going to be presenting, but we don't want to take away from the time of the presentations and discussions. So we'll be doing very brief introductions. I hope they'll forgive us for that. So we'll start with Seda Altuğ, who's a lecturer in modern Turkish history at Boğaziçi University in Istanbul, and works on property, citizenship in the Ottoman East and French Mandate Syria. So Seda, please, 5-6 minutes, please. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for organizing this panel and inviting me to be a speaker. So yes, actually, it would not be a too ambitious statement, I think, to argue that until recently, Turkish and Middle Eastern scholarly and non-scholarly communities sharing common research interests have lived in almost parallel universes with seldom overlapping scholarly agendas and debates. Actually, at least that was the case in Turkey. The last 10 years, however, that is the duration of the war in Syria, has witnessed an exponential increase in the scholarly and public discourses in Turkey about the social, political, and humanitarian issues about the Middle East, in particular Syria, however, only to the extent that it concerned the interests of the Turkish state's domestic security concerns, namely the dismantling of the Kurdish autonomous administration in Syria and the authoritarian Islamism of the AKP. Actually, it is mainly through the AKP's political and ideological engagement in the war in Syria and the refugee question that Syria and the larger Middle East are introduced to the Turkish public. The peculiarity of the Turkish involvement in Syria, however, does not only lie in its support of the Islamist branch of the anti-Assad opposition in material or political ways or the presence of almost 4 million Syrian refugees in Turkey. The peculiarity lies in the production of a new cross-border space, namely a new regional scale that has come into being throughout the 1 decade-long violent war, yet materialized through a military assault by Turkish military and Turkey-backed Syrian National Army from 2016 onward. The cross-border space in northern Syria is sustained through Turkish social and demographic policies, infrastructural investments, and security politics. There are 3 neighboring Turkish regions of domination of control in northern Syria. There is the cities of Elbab and Jarablus in northern Aleppo countryside with a Sunni Arab majority, which was taken under control in 2016. There is Afrin, a Kurdish enclave in western Aleppo, taken under control in 2018. And there is Tel Abyad and Ras El Ain, a Kurdish Arab mixed region, excuse me, neighboring the autonomous Kurdish administration in the northeast, and that was occupied in 2019. The Turkish government has assumed a direct administrative control of all 3 regions. It has appointed a sub-governor and other administrative officials from Gaziantep, Hatay, and Urfa provinces, respectively. The local councils in these regions, in particular the ones in Tel Abyad, Ras El Ain, and Afrin, as they are taken from the Kurdish administration, are supervised by the Turkish Ministry of Interior. These councils receive their monthly budgets from the related Turkish province, including salaries, infrastructural restoration, and municipal services. These heterogeneous regional spaces represent a significant political, military, and economic investment for Turkey. In the total absence of any international relief organizations, infrastructure and other service provisions are undertaken directly from Turkey in the form of humanitarian aid, education, health, telecommunications, electricity and water networks via private companies in Turkey, and Turkish National Postal Service, which is also used as a bank. Several Turkish ministries also have representatives in these 3 zones. Turkish lira has been adopted, chambers of commerce have been opened, and demographic engineering forms a very important pillar of this new rescaled border zone. Turkey uses population politics in the form of forced displacement of local Kurdish population and resettlement of IDPs in their place as a tool for political control. These zones have then become the new refuge for the IDPs from rural Damascus, Homs, southern Syria, and Idlib, as far as Deir Zor and Raqqa. So, what we witness is a change in the regional scale as part of the wider political process, that is the war in Syria and the Turkish military control of these 3 zones, sustained by Turkish infrastructural, demographic, and security policies. The new regional scale, through its geographical organization and territorially shifting forms of governance, has a very important role in the reconstitution of the regional and Turkish national political and cultural discourses. Syria has come to stand for a range of unresolved local, political, cultural, and ideological conflicts in Turkey, from increasingly authoritarian Islamism to the changing terms of the Kurdish issue, or from the labor market regulations to the citizenship regime and the state violence in extraterritorial regions. Thank you.
Thank you. That was actually less than your allotted time, so we'll give you a little more in the next round. Thank you, Seda.
Thank you, Seda. Okay, moving on then to Maziar Ghiabi, who is a welcome lecturer in medical humanities and politics at the University of Exeter. Maziar is the author of Drug Politics, Managing Disorder in the Islamic Republic of Iran, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2019 and won the 2020 Nikki Keddie Award Book of the Year by the Middle East Studies Association. So great pleasure to introduce you, Maziar. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you, Sydney, for having me. I'll be thinking a bit with some of the presentations Seda actually introduced now, some of the concepts. And apart from my work on drugs, I am also interested on the political developments in the wider region. as embedded in global process of change following the so-called Arab Spring. And the three concepts that I think have been defining the region within the wider global political processes are, in a way, revolt, which civil war, and displacement. So in trying to think with these three great concepts, I think we have an opportunity to understand how we can situate the Middle East, or West Asia and North Africa, to be more precise, within a number of processes that have been affected parallelly, actually, the rest of the world. The question that I ask myself, the question that actually came in our project, which is co-authored with my colleague Billie Jean Brownlee, who's not here, is that the political paradigm affecting particularly the Arab world, but the rest of the region as well, following the Arab Spring, is no longer the question of how to govern a state, or how to govern a country, but actually who belongs to it. So this suggests, to a certain degree, a process of depoliticization of the region and of the political mobilization that were manifest in from the 2010 and even before that, actually, characterizing the Arab Spring. But the question is not that there is an emergence of a new sectarianism. Sectarianism here is a very specific tool which is used to depoliticize contentious politics, particularly when coming from below. In this situation in which revolt is transformed and sort of moves into a situation of civil war, characterizing not simply countries like Syria or Iraq, but actually the broader political context in the rest of the region. In Egypt, for instance, where the struggle between Islamists and sort of a military junta is also characterized by civil war tensions, or Turkey, where the struggle between the central state and the minorities, but also the general progressive forces of the left, have become a sort of a latent civil war. Civil war becomes a new paradigm to govern the conflict, and particularly by those holding power in state institutions, it is framed through the question of who belongs to the house or who belongs to the nation, rather than how should we govern the state. Within this context, and there's not much time, I mean, to develop all of this, but there is a revival throughout the region, and Israel is also a case of this, but it's a long-standing case of this, of the revival of mythologies that belong to an ancient past or an invented past or a recent past that justify the framing of the civil war. So far from me to define the struggle in Palestine as one defined as civil war. It is, of course, a colonial occupation, but the question has become one of who belongs to the house. So in philosophical terms, it's a question about identity rather than how to govern a state. Whereas the real struggle is how to govern the land and how to redefine political citizenship. So I'm actually moving between concepts. If it's a bit too, sort of confusing, I apologize. But so I was introducing my presentation with the concept of revolt, of civil war, and the third one was displacement. And displacement here, which is of course caused by the failure of political revolt, but also by the ongoing situation of civil war, is to be understood on a multidimensional level. That is to say, it's a displacement caused by wars, territorial, of course, where people are scattered across the region and beyond, and therefore lose their connection with the territory. But this displacement is also to be understood as something that affects the imagination and the political emotions of people, which connects us to the idea of mythologies again. So people reframe their political life, so their the fact of seeing themselves in a political struggle no longer as part of a redefinition of their status as citizens, but tend to see it as reviving old mythologies. And this is the process that gives rise to the cultures of the right, of right-wing politics. And it's quite sad, but actually we can see that following the failure of the political revolts in the Arab world, particularly, but across the region, and in part we can see that also in the West. I mean, the rise of the right had made use of an imaginary displacement of people, so the sort of political reference have been lost. And instead, a language of civil war, instead of how to manage political society, has emerged. So I don't think I have much time, right? Do I have like 1 minute?
No, you're about up, Mazia.
Okay, so yeah. I would say that nothing conclusive, of course, but I think these three ideas, revolt, civil war, and displacement, can help us to resituate the region within wider political processes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mazia.
Okay, we move to Arang, so we stay in Iran, but perhaps other sorts of issues and other sorts of cross-regional relationships. So Arang Kashavarzian is a professor of Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies at New York University, and we should say New York University in Manhattan, because New York University has colonized many spaces. So he's in Manhattan, and works on political economy and history of Iran, the Gulf region, and further afield as well. So please go ahead, Arang.
Thank you. Thank you, Setsini and Adam and all the organizers for inviting me to this panel. So my approach to new regionalism is less about the contemporary and current events and more in terms of thinking in different ways about region and regionalization. So for the past few years, I've been studying the politics of the Persian Gulf. But my approach has not been in terms of international relations between nation states or to foreground the foreign policy of one particular great power or another. Rather, I've come to this project in order to explore the category itself, the Persian Gulf region. So I'm asking questions such as, in what sense is the Persian Gulf a region? In what ways and by whom and through what processes has it been regionalized in the past 2 centuries? What is meant by it being a sub-region of the Middle East, or sometimes known as a world region that has global resonance and importance? When we think about the politics of the Persian Gulf, we often conjure up battles over names: Persian Gulf, Arabian Gulf, the British Lake, the Islamic Gulf, a term that was used after the 1979 revolution to try to be more inclusive, at least for Muslims. It was used was the Islamic Gulf, or quote, the umbilical cord of the industrial free world. This was the metaphor used by Caspar Weinberger to describe the Persian Gulf region. Now, these battles over nomenclature and alternative conceptions index a notion that politics of the Gulf is about ownership of a territory and control over a body of water, and with that, the hegemony over its littorals and adjacent lands. It evokes the common notion of region as an abstraction, a homogeneous whole with clearly defined boundaries. The question then becomes, who can traverse the space? Who can control or monitor it? Who can exploit it? Who dictates who enters and who exits? And what counts as inside or outside of the region? We're invited to think in terms of region as a location, as a thing, as an it. A lot is missed by this sort of representation of the Gulf and space in general. As discussed by already some of the panelists and a kind of a large swath of critical scholars who work in critical geography and political economy, we have alternative approaches to think about space and territory. And there's a rich tradition approaching space relationally, and not as something that is static or a ready-made stage that is somehow pre-social or apolitical. Following suit with this kind of scholarship, I insist that regions are manufactured through social relations, struggles, and processes unfolding over time, sometimes a long durée, and they're always interconnected, or if you will, interpenetrated by other places and geographic scales. the local, the national, the global, the international, and so forth. That is why, even though for over a century, the Gulf has been conceived of as a regional whole, it has also been treated as vulnerable, as unstable, and with its borders constructed, eroded, and overlain by evolving forms of trans-regionalism, built on oceanic, imperial, international, and global connectivities and imaginaries. So through concrete social relations and networks. Additionally, the notion of the Persian Gulf region as homogeneous confuses an aspiration for a reality. Yes, there have been desires to render the Gulf as Persian, Arab, British, or American, but this has never been attainable and is always contested. It's always remained incomplete. Thus, analytically, if we hold on to a notion of the Gulf region as a whole, we obscure and miss the many ways that the region has been fractured, its borders have been rendered porous, and it is simultaneously conceived of as a frontier and a center of economic and political power. In short, places within the Gulf, as well as people that reside in it or travel to it, are differentially positioned in relation to social processes of capitalism and territorialization. Some are mobile, others are immobile. Some have control over their movements, while others are forcibly relocated, deported, expelled, or through enslavement and bondage brought into this space. The regionalization of the Gulf, therefore, is multiple, and therein lies the tension and conflicts, political projects, and countervailing forces. So ultimately, my study of the Persian Gulf history has taught me that all explorations of regionalism must grapple with the simultaneous attempts to create homogeneous geographic entities or units, and how this very attempt at producing order within the region entails fracturing, fragmentation, and bordering of these regions at the same time. And our task, I think, when we think about regions, is to maintain this dualism simultaneously, the homogeneity and the heterogeneity, to pick up the terms that Seda introduced at the beginning of the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Arang.
Thank you very much, Arang. Moving on, it's a great pleasure to introduce Olfa Lemloum, who holds a PhD in political science from Paris 8 University, has taught at the University of Paris Nanterre before joining the French Institute of the Middle East, or IFPO, in Beirut as a researcher. She's currently the Tunisia country director for the NGO International Alert, where she works on border areas and working class suburbs in Tunisia. She's published books, and also she's an accomplished filmmaker as well. So I'd like to welcome Olfa.
Yeah, thank you, Adam. Hi, everybody. Thank you to all the organizers of this event. I would like to share with you some thoughts about the dynamics currently underway in Tunisia 10 years after the revolution. My presentation adopts a local perspective to underline how the overlap between national and transnational dynamics played since the collapse of Ben Ali a relevant role in reproducing the old social hierarchies in Tunisia. My local standpoint is a margin, namely the border governorate of Kasri in west central Tunisia, and the second site of the revolution after Sidi Bouzid, of course. By margin, I mean a territory marked by a long history of dispossession, and this is the case especially for Kasri, grassroots resistance related to the central state. In Kasri in particular, it's a question of the dispossession of the peasantry through its pauperization by the Baedeker taxation regime in the 19th century, then by French agrarian colonization in the 20th century, and then finally by the post-colonial state after independence, with the absence of any agrarian reform, and of resistance through the series of peasant revolts, mainly in 1864 and in 1906. And later, especially from the 19th, it's also about the dispossession of popular youth, the descendants of these poor or landless peasants, from any social mobility due to the structural phenomenon of unemployment caused by austerity policies and economic liberalization. The revolution in 2011, in which these young people in Kasserine played a central role, did not actually reverse this relegation and marginalization. Basically, 10 years after the revolution, poverty and school dropout recorded in Kasserine the highest rate in the country. And in other words, Kasserine remained a margin where the majority of inhabitants survive because of the border and the smuggling. The resilience of this marginalization relies on two levers with transnational dynamics. On the one hand, the so-called war against terror launched against the Tunisian branch of Al-Qaeda in the east of Kasserine by the end of 2012 eclipses the social question and rehabilitated the hard security approach in dealing with this margin. Moreover, it provides international support to the new elite, the ruling elite, as a partner in this so-called war on terror. The second lever is the economy of the border, which since the 19th witnessed a boom in cross-border flows, and the reorganization of the smuggling in the aftermath of the revolution was done by further deepening social hierarchies. So we find that survival and proximity smuggler of basic necessities like fuel or food, etc., are the first victims of the war on terror. Their activity becomes more risky and they sink deeper into vulnerability. The barons who are smuggling expensive products such building materials, etc., and are part of a transnational and structured network have not been affected by the security recovery of Kasserine and seem to benefit from institutional collusion. And finally, the smuggler of illegal substances, like such as drugs, etc., although we have very little information on their modus operandi, they are too part of a transnational network, and their trafficking increased since the revolution, as indicated by the growing visibility of consumption of drugs in Kasserine and around Kasserine. So as a result, in Kasserine, today, the powerful entrepreneur of the border, more or less turning a blind eye to the legality of their business and freed since the revolution from the control of Ben Ali, strengthened their social clientelistic anchoring, and some of them even stood for the last election, I mean, local and even legislative election. My conclusion is that 10 years after the revolution, Kasserine offers a crucial insight to assess low visibility dynamics going beyond centered state analysis, which is usually focused on institutional actors and process, and in doing so reveals the manner in which Tunisia maintains its place in the global and neoliberal order. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alf.
Thank you. I'm already beginning to see several overlaps and connections. It's wonderful that it's turning into a conversation already. So Rima Majid is our next speaker, my colleague and neighbor at the American University of Beirut. She's a professor of sociology, working on social inequality, social movements, citizenship, violence, protest, everything that's happening in Lebanon and beyond Lebanon. So Rima, please go ahead.
Thank you, Satani. Okay, so I have 5 minutes, and I'll try to make to say something that makes sense. So, in thinking about this question of new regionalism, I propose the concept of sectarian neoliberalism, and there are many overlaps with other panelists. So I'm looking forward to the discussion. So, what I want to do with those 5 minutes is propose this concept of sectarian capitalism, or more specifically here, sectarian neoliberalism, as a useful lens to plug the regional dynamics and the social transformations in the region within a broader global order. I therefore use this to tell part of the story of the region beyond the heavy focus on essentialist identity politics readings or the Orientalist tropes of sectarian understanding in the region. But also beyond some materialist readings that overlook or deny the existence of sectarian dynamics, or overlook the important intersection between sectarianism and capitalism. And here I'm talking about sectarianism as a system of discrimination and differentiation that is essential for capitalism. Of course, I mean, the term sectarian capitalism is akin to the concept of racial capitalism. But in creating those debates with a broader literature on the intersections between race and class, or gender and class as well, I deploy this concept of sectarian capitalism or neoliberalism, with highlighting that in this case, I'm talking about a phenomenon that has a higher level of political fluidity, given the fast transformations or the differences in the structures of hierarchy of what we're calling this sectarian system. So this is not to be understood as narrowly just about religion, but more broadly about the politicization of these religious or non-religious differences in society. So this approach attempts to help us understand how sectarianism has not only emerged in its modern form with the emergence of capitalism, which historians have studied at length, but also it helps understand the transformations and the processes of sectarianization have unfolded with the rise of neoliberalism in the region. So more a study of more recent decades. So plugging the regional dynamics more broadly within a global dynamic of capitalism and its reliance on difference and hierarchy to develop and legitimize a divided social order that reveals itself in the spatial layout and varies by scale throughout temporalities as well. Beyond the exceptionalism of the Middle East, this invites us to think about differences and divides in the Middle East as part of a global system of neoliberal capitalism and the politics of populism, or what Madzi in his intervention talked about in terms of the rise of the right wing, especially in times of crises as those we are going through today. So, but also if we shift from the global and look more closely to the local, the discussion on whether it's discussions on clientelism to the analysis of the recent events in historical Palestine, or for example, the role of the general strike, are all important examples where we can think about or deploy this concept of sectarian neoliberalism and think about how capitalism, neoliberalism, and identity politics or politics of sectarian divide have colluded to create the realities we have in the region. In doing so, it's important to move not just beyond methodological nationalism, as Adam highlighted, but it's also important to move beyond groupist approaches that considers or that understand sect and sectarianism as a divide between homogeneous groups. So therefore, you know, all these analyses about the Sunnis and the Shiites, the Christians and the Muslims, the Jews and the Muslims, and looking more at the dynamics of block or group formation, where sect, class, religion, nation, party can become salient and interchangeable at specific historical time. Thus, this creates a broader historical process that structures the social in the region under this process that I call sectarian neoliberalism. So I use this concept to reflect more specifically on the dialectical relationship between revolution and counter-revolution, or more recently, in my thinking, more recently, settler colonialism and liberation struggles in the Arab region, to understand the overlap between, as I said, these two phenomena. Okay, so again, regardless of the state structure in the region, capital accumulation, politics of dispossession have largely been based on processes of ethnicization, sectarianization and racialization, and of course gender dynamics that made sectarian neoliberalism a readily available, but also an actually existing framework of counter-revolution or settler colonialism that is often used but not really understood or explained within those limits. So since I don't have much time left, I'll jump to the end, where I just want to wrap up saying that, you know, beyond just identity, the story of sectarianism in the Middle East and of the sectarian dynamics we are witnessing today is also the story of a global neoliberal capitalism and regional power dynamics and sub-regional dynamics of space production through shifting orders. So understanding the region and understanding these new transformations in regionalism require that we look at this intersection between capitalism and sectarianism.
Great, thank you so much, Rima.
Thank you, Rima. So our next and final speaker is Rafeef Ziada, who is a lecturer in comparative politics of the Middle East in the Politics and International Studies Department at SOAS, University of London. She works on the politics and political economy of transport infrastructures, war and humanitarianism, racism and the security state. And her most recent book is Revolutionary Feminisms, which is published with Verso in 2020, co-edited with Brenna Bandar. Thank you, Rafeef.
Thank you very much, Adam and Satani and all the sponsoring organizations. My computer is telling me that my internet is unstable, so I apologize if I cut off at any point. Regional dynamic, regional dynamic. I wanted to make stepping back to what are actually consistent, what is consistent within the regional dynamic. And what we still see today is many of the underlying issues that caused the uprisings to begin with, like mass unemployment, especially among youth and university graduates, informalization, lack of social support, and indebtedness, are all still consistent 10 years on from the uprising. In the past 2 weeks, the other thing we see that is really still consistent as an issue that has underlied many uprisings within the region is the question of Palestine, of course, where it's not just the Palestinian people contending with the Israeli settler colonialism, but the peoples of the region at large. So those are the dynamics that we still see very overtly at play. What is new, I would argue, is that we today see a much more clearly articulated UAE Saudi axis at a regional level that is intervening financially and militarily across the region. This is not to say that this is a new power structure, just that it is much more clearly articulated today. However, quite often the hyper focus on conflict and destruction in the literature on the Middle East really tends to obscure other spaces of construction, of investment, which are as important to shaping geopolitics and geoeconomic outcomes on a regional scale. And here's where I find the work, or looking at the region through a logistics lens, particularly interesting, because you start to see inter and intra-regional dynamics and how they are playing out. So for example, if you take a closer study at investments in maritime ports, in roads, in rail, in airports, and so-called logistics cities, you really start to see intra-regional economic geographies that are shifting, especially along the Red Sea, where multiple powers are intervening to dominate this very important maritime route. And it's not just the UAE and Saudi Arabia, but of course Turkey and China and a multiplicity of powers are vying over this very important trade route. Multiple investments in transport infrastructures are coming hand in hand with with military bases at the same time. So we see a hyper-militarization coming hand in hand with these investments in infrastructure. They're helping to rearrange relationships within what we construct as a region, but also with other regions as well. So to take just one example here, if you look at the UAE, we see a direct military intervention in Yemen, which very much looks to take control of Yemeni ports. But we also see the long-term infrastructural concessions by state-owned conglomerates like DP World, the provision of military bases and police training. So here we see infrastructures coming hand in hand with coercion. We see military bases, police trainings coming hand in hand with conglomerates like DP World building these infrastructures. They are often sold as giving other states training and giving them support for employment. But what we really see is a hyper-militarization of other regions that are adjacent to the UAE. So for example, if you look at the war in Yemen, the war in Yemen was very much conducted out of Eritrea with soldiers from Sudan. So once you start to see these logistical links, you start to see that war itself shifts with these new infrastructures that are being constructed. From the long-term concession at the Sukhna port, at the southern end of the Suez Canal, to the investments in ports in the Republic of Somaliland, you really see a story of intra-regional dynamics that is emerging. These infrastructural interventions are having long-lasting implications, and they are really laying the groundwork for geopolitical dominance by the UAE and Saudi Arabia to an extent within, if you take the lens even broader, within China's proposed One Belt, One Road network. And this is why the multi-scalar approach that many of the speakers have spoken about is really apt when we start to look at these logistical networks and how they are built and what this circulation means. But despite the win-win scenarios that promote this type of intra-regional connectivity, what we are really seeing is that they are rife with tensions. They are inserting actors like the UAE into conflicts that already exist, and they are generating contradictory rivalries on the ground. So tracing these logistical spaces and supply chains also clearly points us to another regional dynamic that I would say is emerging, which is an increasing overlap in the cross-border spatial cartographies of military operations, humanitarian aid delivery, and commercial transport firms. So for example, the UAE's commercial cargo planes were extremely central to its military strategy, helping to create air bridges to the places it was bombing to help refuel the pilots. Meanwhile, it's also very well documented how private UAE-based logistics firms have helped to circumvent the arms embargo on Libya. Both international and regionally based logistics firms operate across multiple sectors. They service militaries on one hand, while also forging long-term partnerships with aid organizations. In the United Arab Emirates, for example, there is a space called Dubai Humanitarian City, which is the regional logistics hub for humanitarianism. So here you have on one hand a state that is both bombing Yemen and on the other hand being the central hub for aid in Yemen. And just before getting on the call, I saw a fantastic article by Merip around aid in Yemen and the business of aid in Yemen and how it's functioned. So I urge everybody to read it. It's a fantastic article. And of course, I'll end on this note of a shout to the wonderful work that they do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rafi.
Okay, so I've taken many notes and I see a lot of cross-cutting issues, and I'm sure that our participants will also be posing questions. The questions have already started to come in. But Adam and I had a couple of questions that we wanted to pose to you and to get your reactions to. And this is in the spirit of that sometimes focusing on a particular process or a particular place or a particular issue illuminates and brings together the sorts of issues you've been, the wide range of issues that you've been bringing up. And so we have this rather bizarre coupling of questions, one on Palestine and one on COVID. And the idea is, whether through the lens of Palestine and the lens of COVID, we can sort of also discover some issues which relate to, first of all the actors that you have all brought up, with, let me focus on Palestine, that we see so many of the actors that you mentioned involved in this latest round of conflict and violence in Palestine, but also how Palestine itself is being made and unmade at the same time, perhaps more unmade than made at this point, but no, also made by Palestinians themselves, who are coming together across all these many divisions, these many boundaries and borders. So yeah, so my question is, and it's prompted a bit by, I remembered the first line in the book by Samir Amin, the book called The Arab Nation, which when it came out disappointed many of his Marxist friends and colleagues, because it was dealing with issues of identity and so on, and political economy, of course, but it was felt that he had somehow sort of gone astray a little bit, and in that book, and the first line of the book says, everyone in the Arab nation is extremely sensitive to the issue of Palestine. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, are very sensitive to the issue of Palestine. How could they not be? Like, that's the first question, like, how can you not be sensitive to the issue of Palestine if you're part of this Arab region? And I would expand that to Iran and Turkey now. Perhaps at one point they were a little bit distant in the past from the issue of Palestine, but they're certainly integrally involved now. So that is my question about how the latest events in Palestine, but Palestine more generally, Palestine as an issue, can help us understand sort of the making and unmaking of regions, and the way in which the making and unmaking happens simultaneously.
Thank you, Stephanie. And to add a question onto this, which we'd also like the panelists to respond to, is around the current and ongoing pandemic, which obviously has had a major impact on many countries in the region, overlapping, of course, with the preceding 10 years since the uprisings and the various crises that we see in the area. So I'm interested in how the panelists might reflect on the pandemic's effect at a number of different levels. One is that just prior to the pandemic, we saw some quite inspiring struggles in the region, and many people talked about this as being a new wave of the uprisings in places like Lebanon and Iraq, Sudan, Algeria. And I'm wondering what effect the pandemic might have on the politics and political mobilizations, whether in those countries or more broadly in the region. Or perhaps another way of looking at this question, and to bring in the wider global context here, is to think about the pandemic and the question of vaccines, the very lopsided and uneven distribution of vaccines that are obviously present at the level of the global scale, but also very evident within the region itself. Some people have talked about this as a kind of vaccine nationalism. Another term that I've seen used recently, which I think is perhaps a bit more apt, is the term vaccine apartheid, in the sense of who actually gets access to these things, and as well the politics of the various distribution of vaccines, notably the politics around China and Russia as two main distributors of vaccines in the Middle East, as well as the vaccines produced by wider Western companies. So I think this is another way of thinking about the effects of the pandemic beyond its immediate health impacts, but also how the access to vaccines might be impacting or might impact kind of the regional dynamics in this kind of way. So before I open up to our panelists, asking them to respond to one or both those questions, but very briefly, so we get time to hear from the audience. But would also like to remind you, if you are on Zoom with us, please drop a question in the Q&A. We've got a couple of questions already. And if you're on Facebook, please also drop some questions on Facebook, and we'll ask them to the panelists as well. So let's begin the same order that we said before. So Seda, would you like to respond? If you just speak for a couple of minutes.
Okay. Yeah, apparently the impact of the pandemic in Turkey was unequal, and it basically deepened the existing inequalities even more exponentially. Actually, the pandemic hit Turkey in the middle of a major economic crisis and a political rivalry between the current government and the opposition and various opposition bodies. Therefore, there was no, I mean, basically the government tried to, capitalize on the pandemic in order to increase its popularity. It rejected any kind of cooperation between the municipalities and the doctors' medical association. And basically, even worse, I think it gave the government to deepen its autocratic rule by silencing critics and very rapidly passing restrictive new laws to limit dissent and to forbid any kind of public gathering and so on. So yeah, basically it was used as an autocratic rule in the hands of the current government, and there has been very widespread anger against the government as well because of the arbitrary measures, because of the discrimination in applying all kinds of pandemic measures in different ways to its party loyalists and to the rest of the population. And these happened in funerals, in party gatherings, in party congresses, and so on. Yeah, I think I would, that's what I would like to say. And when it comes to vaccine, the planning of vaccine and other measures, of course, as you can imagine, they were quite unequal and badly planned and full of, mistakes, U-turns, omissions, half measures, and very last-minute announcements of lockdowns, etc. So yeah, that's what we have been going through. And as for Palestine, I mean, Palestinian issue, I mean, it's a controversial issue for Turkey because, I mean, it is mainly the Islamists and the Turkish governments who try to capitalize on the Palestinian issue, yet represented as an, as a religious matter rather than an issue of equality and against settler colonialism. And again, during the under the COVID measures where there was lockdown, actually after where there was curfew after 9 o'clock. In the evening and lockdown during the weekends. For instance, demos for Palestine were allowed, but demos for other kinds of gatherings and demos to be held by the opposition groups were not allowed. So this also created a rift. This also deepened the rift between and polarization among the society. And unfortunately, I mean, the Palestinian issue in Turkey has been discussed again through the lens of Turkish politics and through Turkish cultural, polarizations and so on. I mean, there is, unlike what has been going on in the Arab world and also in Western Europe and the US, it has rarely been discussed through as an issue of equality, as an issue of, as I said, against settler colonialism and discrimination.
Thank you, Seda. Mazia? You're on mute, Mazia.
Apologies, sorry. Two very big questions, but I think, the connection that we can find in them is that actually, if we think about the pandemic, one of the effects at the social political level is the generation of fear. Fear, it's something that actually connects to what I was trying to discuss earlier, which is the rise of the cultures of the right. Fear produces lack of trust, lack of social bonds, and the pandemic has in a way affected, as we know, everywhere, but perhaps in contexts where vaccination programs are slower and haphazard, the social bonds tend to be have a longer term effect. In a way, we are in a situation in which the epidemiological crisis, which is the virus circulating, is creating also an epistemological crisis, which is produced by the lack of knowledge and lack of the sharing of knowledge about the virus, like lack of trust in viruses, the geopolitics of the vaccine, which is, as you suggested, how we can distribute vaccines equally, but also who trusts whose vaccines, which is another question. Which at the popular level is actually quite a big issue, not simply in the Middle East, but also in Europe. People distrust the English vaccine, but trust the Russian one for no plausible reason, and vice versa. I could elaborate a bit more on that if you want later, especially because I've been working on COVID politics a bit, but I don't want to take too much time. But the question of Palestine instead, I think just very briefly, and it connects to, again, my shorter presentation earlier, is that Israel has become, in a way, a paradigm state for right-wing politics everywhere and right-wing politics in the region. The sort of strongman rule that has emerged in Egypt, in the Arabian Peninsula and elsewhere, looks at Israel as a successful political project. And there is a level of imitation, I think. And this connects to the global rise of the right, from Bolsonaro, who is always with the Israeli flags, to Modi in India, and the sort of the idea that we need to identify who belongs to the nation, and so the political project is about that, not about governing actually the problems and issues. That's just a quick.
Thank you, Mazia. Aram?
Okay, let me take the issue of Palestine to think about the Persian Gulf region, and then vice versa, to use what my thinking about the Persian Gulf region to think about recent events and the escalation of the intensification of the struggles in Israel and Palestine. So I have two comments, I guess. One, well, first of all, Rafif really nicely laid out what she describes as this kind of UAE-Saudi axis that is, in a sense, reconfiguring more clearly than ever something that we call the Middle East region more broadly. And I think that's very important. But another way to think about it is the events of the past few weeks, but also going back to the Abraham Accords and this the normalization of relations between the UAE and Israel, and Bahrain and Israel, and the fallout after that really does show how it's almost impossible to talk about a Gulf or Khaliji response to Palestine, because it's become so clear that the fault lines exist, not only between, if you want, the UAE and Bahrain, who've normalized, and then if you want Kuwait and say Oman and Qatar, who have maintained, at least in public, a degree of resistance to normalization and so forth. So you have those kind of the international relations of this within the Gulf region, and of course Iran taking a different position. So there's deep divisions between these states, but also what's clearly emerged in the last few weeks, from what I can tell from the United States, is the enormous divide between the governments and citizens and residents of these countries, where there has been various forms of criticism of normalization, solidarity with Palestinians, and so forth. And so that disconnect is quite palpable. So it really does make it hard to think about the Gulf region as this coherent political unit. And the other way I've been thinking about this is one of my kind of, if you want, my conclusions of my work on the Gulf region is to think about borders not as kind of fixed lines on a map or kind of impenetrable walls, but to think of borders like membranes, like the membranes in our skin, which are designed actually not just simply to keep things out and define jurisdically inside and outside, but they're designed actually to let some things in and repel other things. So to think in terms of membranes. And over the past few weeks in Palestine, what we've seen is that these walls, and quite literally in the case of Israel, security walls, checkpoints, and so forth, that are ostensibly created to divide Israelis from Palestinians, but divide Gaza from West Bankers, 48 Palestinians from, and so on and so forth. So we think of them as these strong walls, but how, in fact, they've never really been designed that way. They've always been designed to be porous, strategically porous, allowing, if you want, Israeli settlers, Zionist settlers to move to the West Bank and build townships and vice versa. And what we've seen in the last few weeks is clearly some of these, let's call them right-wing extremist Zionist groups who engaged in various forms of vigilantism over the last 10, 15 years in the West Bank, using those tactics inside the Green Line in Lida or Lod and Haifa and elsewhere, right? So that border is very porous for some people, right? And very close for others. And conversely, a notion of Palestinian solidarity has been reaffirmed, reactivated, strengthened, as we've seen in these past few weeks, that it doesn't matter which side of the border on, you share the same fate as other Palestinians, and you're operating under a single system of oppression, Israeli oppression. Now, that solidarity, of course, what it requires is this cross-border kind of solidarity requires social formations, organizations to make it sustainable, right? But that the borders is porous and can be made porous and can be subverted for alternative ends. From my perspective, when we go back to the Gulf, is then can we think about Iranians and Iraqis, Kuwaitis and Iranians, Emiratis and Qataris, and so on down the line, also taking advantage of the porous nature of these borders, not to reify these borders, and can those borders also be reified to reimagine new politics? And of course, that's a very difficult thing, but that's what I can see through this kind of new approach to regionalism.
Thank you. Thanks, Arang. Olfa?
Yeah, thank you. I try to answer both questions very briefly from Tunisian perspective, with maybe some implication in terms of in regional terms. On Palestine, of course, we certainly need some distance from the event to assess the impact of this war, etc. But what we already maybe see in Tunisia is that from the various initiatives, demonstration, performances, campaign on Facebook organized against the Israeli attacks, firstly, it confirmed a shift in the form of solidarity for Palestine in the country. Notably the deployment of grassroots mobilization, led in particular by football ultra groups, which is a regional phenomenon. And this form of self-organization anchored in urban marginalized area keeps alive the reference to the resistance today, and especially among youth of popular classes. So there is a kind of today space, not only in Tunisia, but Nigeria, in Morocco, a space of a kind of nationalism from below, without any direct relationship with the traditional institution, parties, or or ideology, etc. The second point is this various initiative also offered more visibility in Tunisia to demand calling for a law criminalizing the normalization with Israel. It embarrassed Ennahda, the Islamist party in office, and pushed it to announce its intention to finally submit a law to the parliament to criminalize normalization with Israel. But of course, watch this space because nothing is certain. But again, it tries more globally the question of the evolution of Islamism in power vis-a-vis of the question of normalization and Israel, and it's available also in Morocco. On Corona now, virus, very briefly, in Tunisia, this health crisis has strongly impacted the poorest people, increasing unemployment and territorial inequality, especially in terms of access to healthcare and social security. And from last November, this situation provoked a new wave of protests in several marginalized gouvernorates, which culminated last January with riots in many working class neighborhoods in Tunis, in Kasserine, and in other places, to which the government responded with repression and large campaign of arrests, in particular of hundreds of minors. And this new wave of protest and repression, I think, confirms something important in Tunisia and even in Algeria now, that the coronavirus didn't stop the social movement. And in Tunisia, the democratic, it's clear that today, and still till today, the demand for dignity and justice have not lost their potential to mobilize, especially among youth.
Thank you very much, Alpha. Rima.
Yeah, thank you, Adam and Satani, for the questions. On the question of Palestine, I think it's really important to approach this within the broader context, the recent context of both, as Arang was saying, this wave of normalization that at the regional level was, at that time, many people were saying, why are we not seeing as much protest against this as one would have expected? But then we, I think this is a direct response somehow, but also to put this within the context of this second wave of uprisings and understanding and this is where looking at the region, understanding the region more broadly from the the economic structures of, whether it's about youth unemployment or also the very dire situation under occupation that is of course not similar but also comparable, I think, to situations of in terms of here I'm thinking youth unemployment, I'm thinking about the neoliberalization, deregulation of markets, deregulation of labor, etc. So these are all, I think, important to understand what is happening in Palestine today within this broader regional setting. And I was thinking just now that the effects of what has happened in Palestine were very important, for example, in a country like Lebanon, where the COVID lockdowns have kind of calmed down a bit the streets of 2019 or early 2020. And this was really of course, there were still protests, but the last few weeks people who were active felt that we're back to, somehow reactivated those networks of organizing, of meeting, of discussing, but it also very much deepened the politics, and I think it's a much needed a process in this broader, if you want to call it, revolutionary process that is unfolding in the region. That Palestine is one of the is the important question today, and it was Syria before, that have deepened the politicization of the groups within the movement, and therefore, beyond the depoliticization that Madze had mentioned before, beyond just the broad slogans of we don't want all of them, the differences and the political differences emerged more clearly. So we've seen groups that opposed the mobilization in Lebanon, saying that Palestine, mobilizing for Palestine is taking away the attention from the crisis in Lebanon, and that we should just focus here, right? While others were saying, oh, this is exactly why we need to mobilize, because these struggles are interconnected and interlinked. And I think, so this effect is a very important and interesting one to follow, because it's kind of deepening and radicalizing the the political process in the region. But on linking the question of Palestine to my thinking about what I'm calling sectarian neoliberalism, I think it applies. I was listening to an interview, I think it was with Rashid Khalidi a few days ago, and where he said, Palestinians have started, or what we're seeing is starting to overcome the internal political sectarianism. And here, sectarianism meaning the political camps, the divides within the Palestinian landscape, very much linked to regional or geopolitical powers. So there's this kind of dynamic of political sectarianism, of course, linked with the what the Palestinian authorities, the politics of neoliberalism, but also the aid economy in Palestine and how these overlap. But then there's also the other side, where we look at the politics of sectarian neoliberalism within the occupied territories or the state of Israel, and this differentiation within Israel. And what we've seen is kind of, I think, a very clear mobilization against those borders, to say, it's one, we're all one despite those borders. And to me, the general strike was a very important turning point. It's it hasn't happened since the 30s, and this is where this idea moving beyond, or this link between sectarianism or the politics of division and capitalism, or politics of neoliberalism, and the attempts at co-opting labor mobilization, etc., becomes very important. So that's on that on the question of Palestine, I think. On the question of the vaccine, it's also interesting because it very much, again, I can try to use this concept of sectarian neoliberalism to think about vaccines in a country like Lebanon, where clientelism is shaping who gets, in many cases, the vaccines or who doesn't. It's also linked to regional dynamics. So, for example, the UAE has gifted Saad al-Hariri vaccines that are from China, and he's distributing them to only his constituencies. So these are all, again, those politics of who gets access, who doesn't, that are very much sectarianized, and also entrenched in those politics of clientelism, but also broader regional and global dynamics of that we had mentioned, of who produces those vaccines, where do they go, and which ones do we trust, etc. So I think there's a lot to be said in thinking about COVID, the vaccines, but also the economic depression and the multiple crises in Lebanon, and thinking about how this has also become a very fertile ground for clientelism, for further division and sectarianization to emerge, and to play, of course, the role of reproducing or reinforcing a certain class or a certain political system that unfortunately is still in place in Lebanon, much of the region.
Thank you, Rima. And Rafif.
Thank you for the questions. I actually think a good way to think about this is to combine the two questions about the pandemic and the current situation, because I think part of why things got to a boiling point has a lot to do with COVID. The fact that there was such overt vaccine apartheid. And I think if there's any place where we can speak about a vaccine apartheid very clearly, it was in the case of Palestine, where you had the Israeli population being vaccinated right there with excess vaccine on one hand, yet the population under Israeli control, they were refusing to give vaccinations to Palestinians in an area under blockade like the Gaza Strip. And I think this intensified the feeling of Palestinians that the unjustness of the situation. COVID also made the already dire economy even worse. If you get statistics of how many jobs were lost because of the lockdowns, it's immense. You look at unemployment figures, they skyrocketed because of the lockdowns, especially in the informal sector. And because of the destruction of the Palestinian economy, the majority of Palestinians are either working in the public sector or informal without contracts. The lockdowns completely stalled their livelihoods. So this pressure cooker of de-development, and I think we need to figure out a word that's even worse than de-development to what's actually happened, really put a lot of pressure on the situation. So the vaccine apartheid, the COVID lockdowns made the situation so much worse. On the other hand, there was all the attempts at normalization. And people were saying that the train is moving, the normalization train, which other states is going to come and normalize. In this context of vaccine apartheid and a dire economy, normalization by some Arab states, I think it led to this moment where the events in Sheikh Jarrah, in particular in Jerusalem, were a boiling point for people to really take to the streets. So I think the two things are really interconnected. With normalization, I think it's useful to go back to what this actually means in effect. One of the first things that was normalized, for example, were flights and the logistics industry between the UAE and Israel, and there's a reason for that. The other thing that had been normalized for quite some time, but became obvious, was coercive measures, surveillance equipment, which is what Israel really practices on Palestinians. We knew there was already trade between Israel and the UAE in coercive measures, in these coercive technologies. Now it's come forward, and we could see how it will impact not just on people of the UAE, but of the region in general. So that's why I think following these flows and these logistical supply chains of coercive measures is really important. But I really loved the way that Setini framed it in terms of the making and the unmaking of regions, because for over 2 decades now, there's been a project of a making of a Palestine that's truncated, of a making of a Palestine without the right of return of Palestinian refugees. And the worst part about that is that there was a Palestinian leadership willing to sign on to this kind of truncated autonomy. I think the general strike was a real important moment for a rethinking, a radical imaginary to emerge, where Palestinians across historic Palestine were resisting at the same time. If you look at the protests that happened earlier on, the first waves of the uprisings, people said, it's just a blip, it will go away. Then there was a second wave. I think what we see in Palestine now is actually part of that wave. And in every wave, people get emboldened and people learn more. This is not to be overly optimistic or romanticize the situation, but I do think it was quite a significant historical moment where a lot of the chains that have been set to divide Palestinians were very broken.
Thank you, Rafi.
Thank you all. We have some questions. Adam and I will take turns, and we won't read them out. Some are quite long, but we've tried to give the gist and let you know to whom the question is addressed. So I will start with one of the questions we got on Zoom, which is to Seda. And the question is about sort of Arabic music in Turkey and musical events with Arab singers and bookshops with Lebanese authors. So the question in general is about sort of interest, but also connection on a cultural level between the Arab region and Turkey. What would you say to that?
Thank you. So the question is, the person who posed the question lived in Turkey until 2005, and he basically observed that there was some keen interest in high classical Arabic music and some translations from Lebanese and Palestinian authors into Turkish. So, I mean, that keen interest of high culture might still stay the same, but I think what is the main difference between 2005 and today is the presence of at least almost 4 million Syrian refugees in Turkey, not necessarily producing, high cultural products, but mainly consuming popular music. I think more and more in their private spheres inside their homes rather than outside due to the COVID regulations, but because obviously there is little space where those connections can be made between Turkish consumers of culture and the Syrian refugees. I mean, except certain, I would say, middle class, more cosmopolitan spaces in western parts of Turkey, mainly in Istanbul and in some parts of border towns bordering Syria, we can very rarely see, music, spaces of entertainment where which is produced through everyday practices of human beings, where Syrians and locals go and go and listen to music and entertain themselves. Yet we are, we hear and more, at least before the COVID regulations, we used to hear more and more popular Arabic music, thanks to street singers, as I said, in certain neighborhoods of Istanbul, mainly cosmopolitan and touristic spaces. And but nevertheless, I wouldn't say that, in working class neighborhoods, spaces of entertainment where locals and Syrian refugees would, visit regularly exists. On the contrary, I would say that especially in working class neighborhoods across the country, we see increasing segregation and anti-refugee, a rise of anti-refugee discourses. Secondly, I know there's very little time left. We also see that Turkey and I would say mainly upper middle class spaces of Turkey has also become quite attractive for Arab tourists who would come and have their wedding ceremonies or have their vacations or come here as tourists. So that also makes the Arab tourists more visible in the public space, and some kind of consumption, music and other goods also more visible and more in circulation. But I would also say that that kind of visibility is also peculiar to certain sections of big metropoles, I would say.
Thank you, Seda. I'll read one of the questions now. We've got from Facebook. We don't have a lot of time left, so I'll ask people to be very quick on the response. But this is a question, I think, directed to Rafif, but anyone, I think, can jump in. It's asking about the relationships, interregional interregionalisms between Asia and the Middle East, in particular what has been described as the quadrilateral relations between US, Israel, China and Taiwan, involving weapons transfers from the US to Israel, from Israel to China and Taiwan, as well as the issues around COVID vaccine and diplomacy. So I think the question is asking how can we understand the relationships with China, East Asia and the Middle East, particularly around issues of surveillance and carceral technologies.
I don't think there's enough time in a few seconds to describe like the complexity of international relations around this and where China fits into the question. I would just say, looking at the surveillance industry and the so-called homeland security industry, you find a politics of circulation that is really interesting, that goes beyond the rhetoric of some states that may say we are supportive of the Palestinians, for example, rhetorically and at the UN. But you see that they have open trade relations with Israel. This goes, for example, for not just the Chinese state, but India has now huge military trade with the state of Israel. There's a lot of trade within surveillance equipment, but also just military hardware and gear between Israel and many states that promote themselves as pro-Palestinian. This goes for Turkey, for example. So it's always very important when states are giving rhetorical support to the Palestinian struggle for freedom to check out, where the money goes and see where the surveillance industry is heading.
Thank you. Stephanie, do you want to ask a final question?
A final question which we must ask, and it combines a couple of the questions that we got in the Q&A, which is about the Arab Spring and basically whether the Arab Spring has changed dramatically sort of the types of relationships and the understandings of the region and connections and interconnections. If you permit me, I'll ask Ulfa to respond to that, and then others can jump in if you want to really add something. But Ulfa, please. Arab Spring 10 years on, but also the more recent waves, I think, of protests. Are relevant to think about.
How to answer, and it's not easy to do that in a few minutes. I think maybe, but I will answer by another question, a question of continuity versus rupture from. Again, from a Tunisian perspective. Actually, what I try to do through my presentation is in bearing in mind the analysis of Eric Hobsbawm, Tunisia and many other places maybe, it shows that power, notably the ability to control population and resource, etc., lends itself to many more historical variation than social and economic structure. In Tunisia, since 2011, the former ruling party has disappeared. The Islamists arrived and are still in power through many and various alliances, etc. However, the social structure and the structure of domination are the same, and Kasrin shows how the powerful entrepreneur of the border, but I use border in the broad sense, the intermediary between national, local, and international market have reinforced the economic and political weight. And of course, the underlying reason are indeed the fact that the successive governments have pursued the same economic and social policies as before 2011. But also, it shows that this evolution confirmed that neoliberalism and power, etc., there is really a real porosity between legal and illegal, between anterior and exterior, between how to say, formal and informal, etc. Not just at local level or in border region, but more on national level and transnational level.
Thank you so much. We've run out of time, and there are other questions we will not be able to get to. But this is obviously a continuing conversation, and it's a continuing project at the ACSS. But I think the issues that have been raised are very important because they also help us think and rethink terms and geographies that we tend to take for granted, whether those are nation states or they are regions, and sort of thinking about what are regions and how regions are made and unmade and how they are porous and how they are constantly constructed is really important. And there have been three main sort of ways in which this has been discussed in this session. And one is spatial, but not just spatial in the sense of taking regions or sub-regions and thinking about them, but about the construction of new spatialities as well, like new border zones or new axes of infrastructures, roads, and so on. But the other way that we've talked about it has been through belonging and identity, between quotes, and sort of discourses and connections that may transcend these borders or maybe enforce these borders or may be used in various ways for creating new boundaries and breaking boundaries. And the third way we've discussed sort of regions and regionalisms is through interests, is through the confluence of interests, which bring in then, sort of actors way beyond the geographies that we're actually talking about. So from my end, I see sort of at least three productive ways in which this conversation can continue, and I hope that we can get together again soon and to continue it. Over to you, Adam.
Yes, thank you, Setni. I think we have run over time. Is there any final comments that any of our panelists would like to make? Okay, I'd like to thank Setni, ACSS, the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at Exeter, and obviously the hosts of this event, the 10 Years On project, for helping bring this together. It's been a really, I think, interesting discussion. It will be available online on the 10 Years On website, and I do look forward to seeing people again at the next event with this project. So thanks again for our audience, panelists, and all of the organizers.
Thank you.